Well, thank you all for taking the time out of your day to join us for this At the Coalface session. Today, we're going to be talking about engaging the power of language to disrupt fraud. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of these sessions before, this is only our second one. We ran the first one with our guest, Tony Sales, about a month ago, looking at the issue of supply chain and procurement fraud, and where we talked about the approach of criminals to getting into our supply chain and how businesses and organizations can protect themselves in those situations. The aim of these At the Coalface sessions are, when we started these, were to really try and put out something there that was practicable and informed to help people deal with first-hand issues of risks, behaviours and pressures on the front line of combating, disrupting or investigating fraud. And so today I'm really happy to have with us Dr Elisabeth Carter, who is an Associate Professor of Criminology at Kingston University and the Director of Carter and Day Consultancy. And Liz is also one of the nicest people in the world, as you'll get to realise over the next minutes of an hour. Now, I'd mentioned the previous session we did, and we're recording these sessions. So that last session, it was available on YouTube. You can see a link to that in the chat. Now, let me tell you about Liz, because Liz is amazing, and that's why I'm very lucky to have Liz join us today. And she'll sit here and never say any of this about herself, but Liz, I'm going to read out some stuff about you, and you can turn your camera off if you don't want to blush. So Liz is a criminologist and forensic linguist who conducts interdisciplinary research at the intersection of language and the law. She examines how interactional, ethical and social drivers are manipulated by fraudsters and the intricate balancing act between power and persuasion, credibility and vulnerability. And we're going to talk about that issue of power and coercion when we chat later in the session. Now, Liz regularly publishes her research in top academic journals, books and industry guidance. She's got a new book out, which I'm sure Liz can talk about as well. Her latest book is on the language of romance scams and reveals key insights into this crime and the ways in which these can be harnessed in practitioner strategies to protect the public. Now, the reason why I wanted Liz to be with us today is because Liz doesn't just provide academic research, she puts that into practice across a real range of sectors. So her research is supporting law enforcement campaigns. She's worked with the Home Office on their fraud strategy. She's driving police operations forward in terms of tackling economic crime. She advises the financial services sector. She delivers training and practical strategies to disrupt the power of fraudulent communications across the public, private and third sector, safeguarding people in positions of vulnerability. And not only does she do all that and be a fantastic person, she's also around the media quite a bit with national TV and radio. And last year, she was the winner of the Outstanding Female Economic Crime Professional at the Tackle Economic Crime Award. So Liz, thank you so much for joining us today. What we're going to cover today are hopefully 5 areas. We don't rehearse these sessions, so I can't promise we'll go through all 5. We'll try and do it, but we're going to first of all talk about language and words, how we receive them, how they're delivered, how they subtly shape human behaviour to the desired results of that kind of coercion and approach by fraudsters. We're going to look at what we can learn from the language used by fraudsters to help victims, understanding that coercive and kind of grooming nature of language, and how we can turn some of that to our advantage to help anyone we assist in our organisation. So I know on this session we've got banks, we've got retailers, we've got housing associations, we've got local authorities. How can you use that in your day-to-day work to prevent fraud? We are going to talk about some of the banking issues, authorised push payment, the consumer duty and fraud warnings, about this real intensity now to see how do we, as the financial services sector, essentially intervene and stop transactions being made where individual victims are being defrauded. We're then going to move on to internal fraud strategies, looking about boosting engagement, controls, whistleblowing, and the language of why people switch off and don't follow policies. And depending on how we're getting on time, we might talk about misconceptions and driving organisational change. So the plan is, as he takes a breath, we'll talk for about 45 minutes. If you've got some questions, please pop them in the Q&A. We're going to look at those in a short while at the end, and we'll try and deal with the ones we know we can answer, and the ones we can't, we'll email you later saying, sorry, it was too clever a question, and we might just tell everyone that you were too clever for us. So, Liz, are you ready?
Yes. Hello.
Okay.
This is great. Welcome, everyone. So pleased you could all join us.
Right. So I'm going to start with IKEA. Yep. Not in any of your papers, not in any of your media clips, as far as I can see. So my insight to my world of learning is I didn't know this until I was older, but if you get a pack of instructions on an IKEA product or any DIY build it yourself product, I could probably spend 4 hours building that product. If someone put a video to show me how to do it, or as audio, I could probably build that pretty quickly. And I want to just start with this first point, that when we talk about language, or when you do your research on language, and we talk about fraudsters and grooming, and we talk about stopping people being defrauded, I just want to understand from your perspective, the power of language. Is it just in the written word, or should organizations be thinking how much can they use video and audio in terms of language?
Oh, well, this is a great question, and IKEA is a really good example as well. Yes, written is the main medium that we all use, more familiar with, starting from school. It's not necessarily the best or the most effective. What I'm not going to do is what's known amongst the deception detection cohorts of academics that I'm part of, which is the body language bingo, which is what we shout if anyone says 70% of what we say is through our body language. Like, bingo. That's just that a lot of what we say comes through our body language. She says as she gesticulates, but really that percentage is just plucked out of thin air. There's no evidence base behind that. But there is a variety of mediums through which we communicate and also through which we learn, and it's not homogenous, and it's not just one route for everybody. Some people are really good at reading instructions or taking information or learning through textbooks or written exams and things like that. Others not so much so. And even the education system, when we're talking about the universities at Kingston, we've started to cotton on to this a bit, and we've gotten rid of most of our exams, and we're starting to do more presentations as well, so students can orally present what they find it quite tricky sometimes to put down on paper. Now, when we're talking about fraud protection literature, now we have a range of partners here. I'm going to use protection, which is what the police use, but if you've got any local authority people here, you folks use prevention in that space. So that's what I mean when I say fraud protection, information that is there to protect the public from becoming victim to fraud. That's usually just written. Sometimes there's something nice on X that is quite visual, but usually it's written, and leaflets and so on that are given out are relatively effective. But they would be more effective if there was the equivalent of YouTube clip explaining it. And this is really important for many reasons, one of which, people don't necessarily think that fraud protection literature is for them because they think they'll never become a victim of fraud. So you're not going to necessarily sit down and think, I'm going to protect myself from this. As much as you wouldn't read your car manual unless or until a light comes up on your dashboard. You're like, what is that? Is that something when you look through your book? People don't tend to have the time. And maybe a lot of people take on information much easier if they're doing something else, like washing up or tidying or anything like that. And they can hear it. Audiobooks, obviously really popular for that reason. There's also a subset of an audience that have neurodiversities. And this cohort, obviously not one homogenous cohort, find body doubling quite useful. So which is when you can see somebody fixing something, for example. If you have trouble with your plugs, you can see someone fix it. And that's actually much easier in our brains rather than just reading about it. And we need to, in a very short answer, as you can hear, we need to harness these multi-channel ways that we access information. I mean, it's moved on as well from the paper newspapers to the way that we take on information in the media as well. There's this multiplicity. It's really important. It's not happening yet.
Yeah, but it seems that's the way people are going to maybe change behaviours, get people to understand about the risk of being a victim of fraud. And it's interesting. So sometimes I'm sitting there thinking, rather than the written piece coming first, so on a warning, or let me take a housing association and they want to make sure their tenants are aware about fraud risk, should the messaging be via a video first, and then there is a transcript of that?
Yeah.
It's about whether I guess people attending the sessions, whether they flip it on the head and say, what do we lead with now in the current way people whether it's verbal or it's audible, it's video or it's written. From a victim's perspective, I was reading some points about this kind of subtle shaping of human behaviour. And I've seen you discuss in the paper about these kind of stages of distorting a victim's reality, and maybe and then I think you call it the setup and drip feed and visceral responses, and then you isolate the victim, and it's quite a journey, isn't it? And
it is, and this differs slightly from general understandings or thoughts about how fraud happens. Now, these are APP frauds, authorized push payment frauds we're talking about, and usually the ones that take place over a relatively protracted period of time, back and forth between the criminal and the victim. And yes, it's rather than these ideas of it's someone giving their money to people they don't know in terms of romance fraud or investment fraud, it's little by little. So a relationship, a friendship, some kind of bond is set up first. The credibility of the person speaking to you is set up. And then also information, this is like the setup and drip feed, information is given that the victim will then later rely on as fact. It gets transformed into fact because it's something they've discussed together. And crucially, it's not housed in any kind of, I need money because of this. It's just, this is the job I have. What job do you have? But within that, there'll be potentially discussions about cash flow if it's a business person, and that will hint at why this person is very rich but sometimes doesn't have money at their disposal. But it's only ever referred back later on when the person's fully groomed as, well, you remember, I'm a business person. This isn't unusual. This isn't money out of the blue. So those mitigations start so early on in that interaction before there's any red flags or alarm bells. So it's a very planned and coordinated process. Visceral responses I find quite interesting, and this is the key place where we can see similarities between fraudulent interactions, particularly investment and romance fraud. It does cover others as well, but these are where it's seen most acutely, where between those and also domestic abuse and coercive control. And this is where the victim feels compelled to protect the perpetrator, and they feel responsible for their physical or emotional well-being, and the responsibility is placed at that victim's feet, and they feel they need to help them. Often you get victims of romance fraud in particular offering money to the perpetrator, and the perpetrator saying, no, I couldn't possibly take your money. This turns understandings on its head of what these types of frauds really are, which is a grooming and not necessarily a financial crime the way we know it. So protection literature that says don't give money to someone you don't know. If someone demands your money, it's a fraud. But actually, this isn't someone you don't know. The person is not demanding money. They're refusing your money. So by proxy, that is actually the person's genuine. And then threats and urgency, they never or very rarely ever appear that way, because the whole context of a relationship, whether it's romantic or any other kind of friendship, is if someone behaves badly towards you, you're going to say, no, this is not right. So they appear very vulnerable, and they invite this protective response, and they couch everything they ask for with mitigations, and they make it seem very normal. A favourite example of mine, if you can have a favourite example, is interactions where the criminals use existing methods that our government use to try and press money out of us quickly. For example, like parking tickets. You pay now, or in 72 hours, it's going to cost more. So you get there's an incentive for paying earlier, or genuine recruitment agencies asking for information within a certain amount of time, otherwise the job will be gone. That kind of urgency is embedded culturally within us, so it won't raise those alarm bells. But what does happen on the flip side when someone's become a victim of these crimes is that they look back with hindsight and they say, oh, they were compelling me to do it. They were saying be urgent. I didn't see it. Of course you didn't see it. It's part of our normal interaction. So we need to be really aware of this. Very slow, everything seems normal, and any slight concerns are mitigated really easily. Those on the outside can see it really easily. Those on the inside just really can't.
And for everybody here to understand this research you've built of looking into how this kind of coercion kind of evolves, to countless conversations and transcripts, and you've listened to recordings, you've seen how firsthand, you've seen how this evolves. So this isn't theoretical, it's based on actual victims
Yes,
court.
it is. Yeah, and I've rather snazzily termed it the linguistic crime scene, because you can see the
It
crime
is snazzy.
unfolding. It is, isn't it? I like it. I would
Yeah,
like to
I
have a
like that.
T-shirt with it on the back, you know, serial crime officer. Um, but you can see the crime happening. It's captured as if it was in real time. It's frozen in time. It's like what it is watching it happen, because I have the transcripts between the fraudster, perpetrator, and the victim. These are WhatsApps, these are transcribed, well, these are phone calls that I transcribe myself, messages on email, anywhere where the language is captured, I analyze it. I do talk to victims as well, but crucially quite different from other research, academic research. I don't use victims' opinions and experiences, how they explain their experiences. I don't use that as data, purely because it's coercion. And you wouldn't necessarily, as someone who's been coerced, go, well, actually, at this point, they did this, and that's how it made me feel, and that's how they managed to get around my defences. Because by the nature of it, you wouldn't necessarily know. And I find that kind of research slightly traumatizing. And I would rather have as a smaller footprint as possible in terms of victim contact. But what the interactions show us, I use critical discourse analysis and also conversation analysis as my key methodological tools.
Just to break down,
Oh yeah,
critical discourse analysis. So
critical discourse analysis. Yes, no,
what
of
does that
course.
mean?
No, I've gone all linguistic. It's my safe space. But yeah, critical discourse analysis is a methodology that you can use, and it's for spoken language, but also written as well. And you use it to analyze different words and phrases, and their position in a conversation, and what it means and what they're referring to. Now with discourse, there are various ways of doing it, but in a very broad level, the power of language is that if I say, I now pronounce you husband and wife, nothing's going to happen, because we're not in the right place. I don't have the right qualifications. We don't have all of the things that need to happen. However, somebody who is qualified to say those words, when they say them, something happens. These people are now married. Their status changes. The same with, sending a ship off and naming a ship and all those kind of things. So language has an absolute power, only within the right context. And what critical discourse analysis allows us to do is examine the ways in which the language is used in that context. And for me, I look at the way that power is manifested. An example of this is topic control. And in many, almost, well, I think in every single fraudulent interaction, when we're talking about romance fraud, investment fraud, courier fraud, there's a massive element of power and control. But where the power appears to be in the victim's hands, but actually is manipulated extremely cleverly, I dare to say, by the perpetrator. So the way in which this is done is that the perpetrator can control the topic and say, oh no, you talk about what you want to talk about. Don't worry about me. I wanted to talk about this
Something else,
deal.
but
If it's
you go
important
first.
to you, yeah, if it's important to you. But you can see how it's really kind of controlled. It's like, oh no, don't worry, I'll talk about your topic. So that's what critical discourse analysis is about. Conversation analysis, I think, is my favourite. It's quite fun. And you look out for how words can really impact the person, and you do this by looking at the next turn. So person A says something, person B responds, but with person B, if you look at how they respond, you can see how they've interpreted what person A has said. So it's encoded in that conversation, one after the other. And what fraudsters do, and what you can do if you're feeling, a little bit naughty, you can manipulate how people respond, or really confuse people. And I sometimes get my students to do this, which is when I'm trying to explain to them about conversation analysis and the theoretical level above it, which is symbolic interactionism. Which you're free to look up. But this is the use of words such as "oh" and "well," and all sorts of different things. I can charge you with this thing to go and do later. If someone tells you something quite normal and banal, or I've done this thing, just go "oh," and then pause. Be like, what happened? Because they think that you're responding to something they've said, but it's completely out of kilter. You're surprised by it. I was a surprise token. Or you can use the word well. Now, when anyone uses the word well, particularly in the beginning of a sentence, it means there's going to be a dispreferred turn to come. So you're going to say, well, I'd have liked to, but I can't, I'm afraid. No one ever says well and then agrees with what somebody's just said before. So fraudsters use this. You can also use this if you want to confuse people, but it just shows how very small and we think insignificant and instinctive responses can be manipulated at source. I must say to everyone watching, and you, Aaron, I don't do this for fun because I spend enough of my time analysing analysing words. So yeah, I think most people who message me are a bit anxious about how I'm going to be analysing it and kind of playing with their language. But it is important to see and to understand that these small uses of words and phrases and even pauses before answering have a massive impact on the recipient. I practice as an expert witness, and much of the work I've done so far is to bring that to life and to show the CPS or to show a jury that this isn't just language, it is just language, but it's so powerful, and the person has often no choice but to respond because of the use of language in this way.
So you could see how in certain like proportionate situations, be it for banking sector or otherwise, where they're looking into what's happened before, which has led to a fraud, this might be the type of analysis they want to get into. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I'm only joking. Only joking.
I love it.
I'm
You're
going
a
to agree
great
with you all the way.
student. And for a second, I was like, oh, wait, what? Yeah.
How am I going to disagree? Okay, so if you get that context of the grooming side and this idea of how organisations can intervene. So I've seen it. So obviously there's the banking side and trying to have effective warnings for customers. Housing associations where a tenant might be under the spell of someone who's trying to have them take up a right to buy or right to acquire option. There's lots of scenarios where you need to be looking at this behaviour point and intervening. And again, I'm going back to some of your work. I've seen a sentence I was reading says a key part of this narrative about intervention is that there's this belief that individuals are able to identify fraudulent transactions or interactions, and have the agency to take action to end them, or can adequately protect themselves through vigilance. And that seems to be a common narrative. If we give enough vigilance, we give enough warnings, and we upskill almost, that people have the ability and agency, to use your word, to stop the transaction. And because they didn't do that, they're partly to blame in the process. And I know you've been quite vocal about victim blaming and how people are not taking into account language. So how can interventions be effective then if people are in a state of mind, state of being where they, I guess what you're saying is they probably haven't got the, not ability, it's just the mechanics in the way what's happening in context right then to stop or to challenge the person they trust the most. What can language do? From now we know how the fraudsters do it, how can we use language for the good side, I suppose, of preventing it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question. I'm so glad you asked it as well. So much of fraud protection literature out there follows the well-worn path, well-intentioned path of this is what fraud is. You must stop it when you are being treated in this particular way, or where you see or hear these particular red flags or alarm bells. You must stop that interaction immediately. Well, you must spot it and then you have to stop it and then you report it. Now, this in an ideal world is beautiful. However, the red flags and the alarm bells that we as a collective put out there as this is what a fraud is just aren't recognizable to most people. It will hit some people, but I dare say it will probably be the minority. And this is partly why we have such a low reporting rate, because individuals aren't identifying as victims. They aren't identifying the interaction that they're in as fraudulent, and they only realise way down the line when either they've run out of money or something else has happened that has enabled them to realise. But it's not necessarily the protect literature that's stopping them. I would argue that there are ways to effectively or more effectively warn people of this is what fraud looks like. But currently, most of the messaging really puts up a bit of a smokescreen. And not only does it stop people reporting it and stopping it earlier, it also lends that sense of shame, but adds to the sense of shame that also stops people reporting it. So we have a really low reporting rate. There's various figures. Obviously, it's a dark figure because we don't know. But I've heard, 5%, 15%. I've heard National Trading Standards scams team say it's around 35%, which is much better. But it's huge, particularly when fraud is the most common experienced crime, and that's based on a small proportion of people actually reporting it. But what we are having, those narratives, means that people who do realise they're a victim of this crime, they think, I should have spotted it earlier because it's so easy. I'm so stupid. Why didn't I spot it? And those narratives are echoed throughout society by family members. You only have to look on Twitter in response to anything, or X, in response to any programme around romance fraud in particular. And the narratives are, how could they be so stupid? Well, how did they not spot it? And it's because it's driven into us, it's embedded in us that it should be easy to spot. So what can we do instead? We need to move away from case studies, from pictures, particularly old people looking concerned. We need to move away from this because this does not represent, it represents a very small section of the community, a very important section, but very small. And we need to move away from this narrative, people you don't know. Don't give money to people you don't know. Yeah. When we're talking about interpersonal fraud, courier fraud, the fraudsters are impersonating banks, police officers, people you trust. We've got romance fraud, where somebody is somebody you love. They're fake or not, they actually, the victim loves them. Much like in coercive control, it's like, well, I still love the person even if they're doing this stuff. And investment fraud, it's somebody that you've trusted and you've gone through lots of investments with, you've had a return with. So it's not someone you don't know. Any Protect literature that mentions that excludes that whole section of individuals that do know the person they're talking to. That doesn't apply to me, it's fine. And it renews that sense of I'm fine because it doesn't mention my situation. Now, this is an implicit seeking. This is not something that people do explicitly, saying, looking at that, no, I'm still fine. But it gives more grist to the mill psychologically. And really, as humans who are being coerced, and anybody doing something that they hope is right and the right thing, they're looking for reasons why that is true, not reasons why it's not. So what we can do instead is move away from case studies, because it's just another reason to say, well, that won't happen to me, that hasn't happened to me. And also move away from case studies where it's some poor, sad, lonely person, where it just adds to that narrative of these are the people who are victims of fraud. They are, but vulnerability comes in all forms. You might have dropped the kids off late for school and are in a hurry, then you get a phone call from your bank. You're already flustered, you've made one mistake today, you want to make a good decision next. So it's vulnerability comes in all forms. But also thinking about our own visceral reactions. So, I said that you don't normally get a fraudster saying, hurry, hurry. They will make you feel hurried instead. So the alarm bell, the flag that people are looking out for is, give me money right now. That doesn't happen. But what happens instead is that you feel like you need to give the money now. You feel like you have to do it quickly and in secrecy, because if you don't, you're betraying a trust, and this situation is urgent. It comes from you, it comes from them, but you feel like it comes from you. So if you put out a narrative as, check in with yourself. How are you feeling? Is your heart racing? Do you feel like you need to act really quickly? That is the moment you need to speak to a friend. Tell them about it, quickly get their advice. It's not saying this is a fraud, it's actually check in. And I have in a couple of talks, you might have heard me say this, I liken it to a seatbelt. You just put it on. You don't expect to be in a crash, just like you don't expect the person that you're falling in love with to be a criminal, but you put your seatbelt on anyway, and you protect yourself anyway. And this leads me to one of my main protection messages, is that be really open and clear to the person you're speaking to that you're fraud aware and you protect yourself in every case, not just when you're worried. A lot of what's out there, you know, Stop, Challenge, Protect in particular, is that do this if you're worried. But fraudsters don't worry people, because that's the way you scare people away. So you do it in every single situation. And if anybody you speak to doesn't like it, if you're speaking to someone on the bank and the person says, well, you don't need to protect yourself from us, we're the bank, that's when you hang up the phone and you dial 159 to get through to your bank. Same as in a relationship. Particularly in a relationship, if you're trying to protect yourself, that's something that your loved one would cheer you on for, and make sure you feel safe. So in a nutshell, get people to check in with themselves. Don't necessarily say, if the criminal does this, then, or if the person you're speaking to does this, then do that. It does a few things, makes it more relevant. It doesn't bracket off any particular people from thinking, you know, it's not me, can't be me. But also it future proofs our protect messaging in a way that it doesn't become an arms race. Because if you say, this is what fraud criminals do, they will stop doing it. Okay, much like in the airport, you know, we have to take off our shoes in the airport because that happened once in history, but now we have to do something else, and you have to keep maneuvering. But if you check in with yourself, something that all fraud criminals do is make you feel a certain way and make you feel okay doing it. If we can tap into that and guard people against that, then the fraudsters don't have anywhere to turn.
And that sense of, you know, for me, it's like a breadth of understanding of what the potential risks are. So you talk about the seatbelt. On talks, I often talk about crossing a road, and you know, as a child, you learn to look right, then left, then right. You learn to say put your seatbelt on, and it's just second nature to you. You look out for the risk and the hazard. I was just thinking though. So say, you know, I know from some cases, be it on the litigation side or just training, I've seen that organisations forget the very basic of, they don't define for their audience what fraud is.
Yes.
And so, you know, if I have everyone on this call talking about, well, if you print something in the office using your workplace, your employer's toner, but it's a personal flight receipts or something, you know, is that just theft, or is it you're drifting into some dishonest action? It's about what we normalise.
Yes.
And I do wonder that protect messaging starts from a place that we've normalised certain behaviours too much. So for the idea that you trust somebody, therefore they are not going to be someone you don't know, we've normalised it.
Yeah.
And I was looking at things for the banking sector. You have this thing about, you'll know about consumer duty that's come about, and part of that consumer duty pressure here is about making sure you have the correct level of messaging, and you're monitoring the messaging, and you're checking how useful it is, because you've got to stop this foreseeable harm. But what I'm hearing from you, Liz, and it's from one of the podcasts I mentioned, we spoke about this before, is that you've done, is that it's getting to this point where, I think this is your sentence, people are in a situation where their fingers are doing the talking before the brain can do the thinking, which as I say, you should put that on a t-shirt. That's a pretty cool phrase you've come up with. I'd buy it. It's how do we, in a frictionless world, you know, with language, where everything's meant to be done quicker, how do we allow that pace of the world but slow people down in their thinking and their act? It feels like a real challenge for me.
It is, and I have a very unpopular opinion about this. Our world should not be frictionless. The financial industry should absolutely take responsibility and say, we don't need money to go that quickly. There is absolutely no situation I could imagine that needs to have payments going that quickly. Many countries around the world don't have it. And the only thing that happens is that people will send that money, and then there'll be a hiatus, there'll be a moment. And I'm doing research actually in the moment around how long is that? And then they'll go, oh no. And then they'll talk to their friend, they'll talk to their sister or whoever and go, I've just done something stupid. And you'll hear that phrase over and over again. Number one, it's not stupid, but they will have that moment, that heart sinking, stomach churning moment they've done something wrong. Now, imagine a situation where that happens, they've clicked it. Oh no, but their bank hasn't sent the money. They've held it because that's what banks should do. They're going to hold it for a time. They'll have to decide what time that is and then release it to give that kind of latency period that, hang on, there's no pressure now. Fraud criminal's not on their back anymore. There's going to be, just like in domestic abuse, there'll be that fallow moment after psychological or physical abuse. And in that moment of clarity, when you don't have someone hounding you on the phone, but not actually hounding you, they're loving you and they're telling you all these things, you have that moment of clarity and you realise. And then you phone your bank and they say, okay, don't worry, it hasn't gone yet. Imagine the relief.
Well,
You know.
it's interesting because there's going to be that tension out there, because you've got the law changes going on the 7th of October, where if a bank suspects fraud, they can hold the transaction for up to 4 days. But they've got to suspect the fraud.
Yes, that's the
basis
key.
for that first. But then you have this position, I suppose, from a banking perspective, where it's a contract. The customer says, I want to make a payment. You've got to follow it through. And I think that's where I find the challenge in this whole world is it's difficult, because from a consumer perspective, I want to see the protection. You want these transactions which are out of the ordinary picked up and suspended. But then from the banking perspective, I know that there's an expectation of consumers that things have to move very quickly. You're going to be criticised if you don't do that. And also, it's really hard, I think, from a victim and a banking perspective, to spot a transaction. You just spot a transaction where a customer perhaps has made a transaction. It looks like they might have been, let's say, duped, or a transaction where they are being duped, but it's been completely caused by that coercion and grooming of a fraudster. That it's over time. It's taken the time, and I guess where I land is there's no easy answer, which isn't great.
No, there isn't. And it's really difficult, because quite often what you will get is victims pleading with the bank's fraud team saying, no, this is me. I want to send that money. This is really important. It's got to go to this place for this reason. But they've been told to say that. And that is extremely difficult. What I would like in an ideal world is for safety to be one of the reasons why people choose banks, just like cars. I mean, I've got one of the really, really tiny little car, but I chose it because it was the best in its class for safety. I could have chosen a slightly bigger one that was not the best in its class for safety. And of course, when we're driving, we can really recognise there are real implications if you are in an accident on your physical body. But we don't have that understanding as human beings when we're on the internet, for example, or chatting with someone, through WhatsApp or other messaging services. So when it comes to fraud, our protections just don't match that. But really, speed is seen as something that's really important for people when banking, but safety should also be. And I think the financial industry could really work with that. Say, look, we are the safest. But what I'm seeing at the moment is not banks, but other financial institutions going, we're not caught by the regulations. Come with us. We can make this go. You can join us. We're less regulated, and that's a good thing. That should not be a good thing. But this is a societal change.
Yeah, there is a change. There is a demand for different types of services. Let's turn our mind to kind of internal protection and internal reward or policies, please. So, classic thing I see is organisations will have a whistleblowing program. It's underused. It's either because people don't believe with anonymity, or they don't understand how it works. They don't use it for reporting the trip hazard. They just use it for reporting the trip, not just stating, look, here's the risks, report through this. Policies and procedures don't seem to be followed. In almost every case, they've always been written documents, and I think that's part of the problem. There's not a but why? What I always try to work out is, why do people switch off? Why does the language in these types of policies, whistleblower, why do people just switch off and almost ignore them? Is there something about the way we use language in our internal communications when it comes to protecting ourselves from fraud as an organisation? Have you seen anything around that?
Yeah, I think when it comes to internal communications, they just aren't that accessible, really. Like this has been drafted sorry, Aaron, by the lawyers. And this is the this is the information. This is the information. But I kind of understand that, because the public facing information, it's obviously public, it represents the company, it needs to be accessible. Internally, it's not, but also it's really hard to get. Sometimes, I'm not saying it's my institution, other organisations, it's hard to actually get hold of these documents. On the intranet is that, you know, or that exists, but also they are just not worded in a very accessible way. They're worded in a very contractual way, where you really have to have a big effort to try and understand, what does this mean in practice? Now, when we're talking about whistleblowing, there's loads of different things that go on here, but when we're trying to get people to speak up about fraud that they see in their workplace, it's incredibly important, because that's the way it's going to get spotted. And more than that, that's what would increase the risk of people intending to carry out frauds within their workplace, if they knew that colleagues would find it distasteful enough, and I use that word quite deliberately, to report it. Now, the thing is that individuals, colleagues, have a better relationship with each other than with an organisation generally. And if you see someone, you know, I'm going to pick on just the lowest hanging fruit. If you see someone taking a load of post-it notes from the stationery cupboard and some pens and things like that, I'm going to take these home for my kids, sort of thing. By the way, I do not do that, for the record. It's likely that your colleagues will not tell your manager, and they will themselves have a narrative about it. Oh, she's had a really hard time recently. She's been working so hard. She hasn't been recognised. She hasn't got promotion recently. Yeah, that's fine. They will make that narrative for you. Or even if they see you and you see them, they might make a joke out of it. Oh, may as well get some benefits from this company. You know, they've you know. So what we do have is a culture of not reporting fraud. And of course, that's the smallest, most theft really from the workplace, but it's the smallest one. Now, if you see somebody doing something larger than that, internally, moving money around, or perhaps claiming overtime when they haven't done that overtime, that's quite a common one. You're unlikely to report it if you have a good relationship. You'd probably talk to the person and they'd go, well, do you know what, I did do overtime 6 months ago, and I put the form in, I never got the money. So again, these narratives. And you, as the potential whistleblower, then is in a bit of an ethical dilemma. Should I do this because it's the ethical thing to do? I'm kind of the boring person that would. See, boring person, see what I did? If you whistleblow, you're boring. Bad. You see, you get these narratives. Or you can think, well, actually, this is a human response. And when I say techniques of neutralization, this is a criminological theory, and it was by academics called Sykes and Matzer back in 1957. That was the first paper on it, but it's been redone years and years, you know, in every single crime type. And techniques of neutralization are ways in which people account for their acts of criminality. So, you know, the company's big, they can afford it, is one of the big ones. Or denying that the company's a victim. It will make no difference. They won't notice. All of those things. Or they deserve it because of something that has happened during your time there, some kind of disgruntlement. Not only do individuals that commit internal fraud have that, but also colleagues that may notice it. Now, they may then get drawn into assisting, in which case they can't then whistleblow because then they're implicated. And this is when we start getting links between internal fraud and interpersonal fraud that happens in investment fraud and so on. And I say that because investment fraud, relatively often, when money goes into your account, oh, this is the money that you've got from your investment, keep £1,000 of it, but can you just send the other 2,000 onto this account? Now you're laundering money without realizing it. And then if you realise, when you realise that a crime is happening, the criminal will then say, well, you've laundered money, so we're both going down together, if that's a problem. And that also happens internally. But it's all about relationships and about people trusting their colleagues, which is good, but more than the organisation. What organisations need to do is bring back themselves into the room and say, look, we are an organisation. We're not a faceless entity. And it's really distilled. It's become much more sharp focus, especially since COVID, because actually being in an office does something. If you're at home, you're not wearing a lanyard, you're kind of in your home territory, you don't feel as surveilled, you don't feel as like in the office in your head, and your ethics might be a bit more lax than if you were physically in there. You don't have colleagues right next to you, you don't have your boss over your shoulder. The return to work in a hybrid capacity, or even in a fully in the office capacity, has negated that slightly, but we still retain some of that difficulties, some of the trauma from COVID. I changed the work practices, but also if your organisation is not then fully present as well and has stayed rather remote in a kind of, you know, abstract sense, not literal sense, you're much more likely to use those techniques of neutralisation rather than say to your workplace, something's happened, someone's defrauding us. And you see the use of the word us there, defrauding us, not defrauding you. You're someone else. It's us, our company, we're together.
And that I guess goes to that point in organisational change, which we might just touch on before we get to putting any questions out there. So if anyone has got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. That certainly post-COVID, the idea that this world where there is more of a demand to work from home, you see, in the office, most of the team are at home today working. Then for an organisation, if you want to have, you know, we're talking about culture, are we? To an extent, are we talking about how do we get our people to do the right thing rather than the right thing for them?
Yes.
Which I think is kind of how people neutralise to think about them. How do you get that more inclusive feel through language then in an organisation? How do people, you know, what are those subtleties? So you said us rather than me.
That's massive, yeah.
Yeah. Are there any kind of, you know, 3 or 4 things you can think of which are, you know, really useful language, just subtleties which actually help an organisation feel more inclusive with their people?
Yeah, I think definitely us is the absolute big one, and there's a lot of booby traps here though as well, because some things that organisations do to try and bring back that kind of family feel don't hit the mark in certain ways. So for example, if you've just had a staff survey and a lot of your employees are saying, I'm really stressed out and there's some issues around mental health, to have, you know, right, we're going to have a full day of mental health well-being, okay, sounds really good, but if their mental health is suffering because they're overworked, this is a really big pressure on time. That's a whole day that's taken up now that you have to squeeze the rest of your work in. And if it's just one day, then that's it, we've done our thing. It seems a bit, you know, a bit posturing. But then again, if you just have a pizza, like everyone have pizza at lunchtime, that could be seen too much of a sticking plaster. So you can see organisations really are between a rock and a hard place. And I've experienced both of those ways, not in my current, but in previous institutions. But really, it's being present and being responsive and aware of what's happening in the office and with colleagues, you know, on a like higher level, and not reserving interventions or ideas for when things become a crisis point, because it's too late. Having moments in the office because it feels natural, rather than this is our mandated time to be collegiate, everyone join in. And little things, you know, a place where people can gather round and chat. And although what we're talking about here is internal fraud, and there must be rules and regulations, absolutely, a relaxing of other rules and regulations. So the whole like 9 to 5, it just doesn't work anymore for most people. But to insist that someone stays in the office from 9 to 5, that's going to build up this barrier between people who are working in the organisation and the organisation itself, which is asking people to do things that are not cohesive with their life pattern and with what they believe to be true and something that should happen. A great analogy here, or a comparator really, is policing. Now, in the UK, we police by consent, and consent of the public. If the public decide that they don't want the police anymore, or they don't want the police to do what they do, there's not enough police officers to stop the public from absolutely rioting, and you can't control everybody. So what the police do is that they build the laws to roughly meet what people's ethics, wants, needs, desires are. And that's how policing by consent does work. We also need to have organisations that match the needs of an organisation in lots of different ways, and not be a barrier to things that, things like happiness, but also trust as well.
It's important. I think you see situations where, you say, for example, the 9 to 5, it's, a lot of organisations want to have, kind of this design by trust, and which is fine. And I think the organisations are worried that if they move away from trust as a control, or as they see it as a control, that's their concern. But for me, it's just explaining to people, look, we don't have controls here because we don't trust you. We have controls here because we want to protect you.
Yes.
But it's just, again, it's the subtlety of change.
Yeah. And I think that's a massive thing as well. The explanation is so key, because human beings do really badly when we're told what to do and there's no reason for it. As soon as you give someone a reason for it, it makes sense, and you can understand it, and you can talk about it. And it's not because of this, it's just, this is the reason why. Because in the absence of any information, people will fill in the gaps. And if they are already in a position where they're a little bit distrustful of authority, perhaps they will fill in the blanks in the worst way possible. So yeah, open conversations. And I guess what I was saying as well with the pizza thing and the mental health day thing is really listen to what people would actually need, rather than, well, this is the solution, you will take it, now you will feel better. So it's kind of, that two-way. And Aaron, even having that discussion by saying that this is not something that you perhaps want, but this is the reason why, it acknowledges that there would be maybe some friction there. And even that acknowledgement shows that you care and you understand that there are going to be these frictions there. So that's all there is. That's kind of the fact that it's a dialogue as well is hugely important.
Acknowledging the friction. No, thank you for this. We've got a little bit, so I've got a question here. So, so I'm saying, really interesting in this. Thank you. Your examples sound more like fraud impacts individuals than medium to larger companies. How does fraud usually manifest in those bigger, for example, food and drink businesses? You may not have specific experience with this. Do the same principles apply when it comes to language? How can they protect?
Well, you have very insightfully noticed this. So the majority of my experience is interpersonal fraud. So it's rather than organisational fraud. However, I have done a little bit, very small toe in the water when we're talking about insider fraud. However, the use of language is extremely similar, but instead of trying to defraud somebody, and to cast your net out wide to find a victim, the victim is already there as the company. Perhaps if it's insider fraud from the outside in, I'll talk about in a minute. But largely the techniques are very similar, but they're usually directed at oneself by trying to account for why I'm doing this. So you kind of talk yourself around it. But then also people who are committing fraud within organisations. And you notice here, I'm very careful with language because I didn't say criminal. Do you see how I didn't say criminal? But I've been calling the fraudsters, the interpersonal fraudsters, criminals. But, this is a criminal act, so they are criminals. But you can see how it's very, it tastes a bit different saying that when it's someone within an organisation. And that's a cultural issue in itself. But a lot of the language that these people committing fraud within organisations are all about trying to seem more credible and more legitimate. And that's exactly what fraudsters on the outside do as well. So they will invoice in a certain way, or they will hide certain things within the existing structure of an organisation, so as to try and avoid any red flags, for example. We've got some main issues with individuals who are trying to commit fraud, insider fraud, and that's others in the office, but also people at every single level through the strands of compliance, really. So you need to actually get other people on board as well, and that's when the interpersonal manipulation happens as well. And that's almost exactly the same as it would happen in romance fraud or a relationship fraud. It would be in that case.
And I've got time for one more before we round up and let everyone away for 1 o'clock. Someone said, is zero tolerance the best terminology to use when there's kind of suggestion here, it's like this kind of scale of distaste. When you see those words about we have a zero tolerance culture in a kind of corporate environment, it's just so disconnected from reality of what you're asking people that language needs to change.
Yeah, I think so. That won't do anything really in terms of whistleblowing, because if there is a zero tolerance, that means there's zero fraud. But that's not true. Really, there needs to be different wording around that, and it also gives a really kind of authoritarian kind of, yeah, we're going to crack down on everyone, we don't trust anyone, you know. It gives me kind of these ideas like these pictures, you know, on the wall, you know, zero tolerance. Really, it has to be a conversation, and those conversations can happen in massive companies as well as little companies as well, and it's about the impact of fraud on a company or on an organization, the impact on the culture of it. What does it mean? I know the NHS Counter Fraud Authority have done a lot of work on this, and some of their images that they use, and they say this is how much money is taken through fraud within the NHS, and this equates to this many ambulances or this much overtime, and it makes it real and personal as well to the organisation and to the people within that organisation, crucially. So the whole zero tolerance approach, it sounds very policing, it sounds, you know, it's that barrier that you have as well. I wouldn't advise it.
Okay, no, I think it's, and that's just the reality, isn't it? I think people facing reality, you know, we're not going to stand out this type of issue.
It's an interactional crime, and you've got to be interactionally acutely aware of the interaction you use as well to be more approachable, so that when it happens, because it always will happen, when it happens you're there or someone else is there and they're okay to come to you with it.
Well, Liz, we've got to, and thank you for giving up your time. It's been amazing to have you here. Hopefully it hasn't been too draining on you, and no one saw all our flapping about 5 minutes before the session there, where we're trying to make sure this team thing's working today. So, you know, hopefully people have seen an air of calm from us both. Well, look, everybody who's joined and managed to stick around for the full hour, thank you so much for giving up your time. I know there are loads of these events out there, and for you to give up your time to hear me and Liz have a chat is really appreciated. We, as we have done with the last event, we will send out a little pocket guide of the best tips and advice we've taken from today's session. That'll be out to you within about a week, and a copy of the recording as well. And look out for the next At the Coalface. We're going to do something else soon, hopefully in the month of May, and we'll contact you all then. But Liz, everybody for joining, thank you for all your time, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.